Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In the heart of an ancient manor, shrouded by dense forests and perpetual fog, stood an ornate mirror unlike any other. It was said to be cursed, one that didn't just reflect what was before it, but took something far more precious, the reflection itself. The locals knew it as the Mirror of Hollow Echoes, and those who dared gaze into it often found themselves changed forever. Many centuries ago, the manor belonged to a reclusive noble named Lord Harrington, known for his obsession with beauty and vanity. He surrounded himself with objects of unmatched craftsmanship, but none captivated him more than a mirror forged by a mysterious artisan. It was framed with twisted silver vines and inlaid with shimmering obsidian stones, giving it an otherworldly allure. But unknown to Lord Harrington, the artisan was not an ordinary craftsman. He was a sorcerer who imbued the mirror with dark magic, a curse born from envy. The sorcerer had been scorned by Harrington, who mocked his appearance, and in retaliation, he created a mirror that would feed on what the noble treasured most, the essence of his beauty. The curse revealed itself slowly. Each time Lord Harrington admired his reflection, he felt a strange weariness. His once radiant complexion grew pale, his eyes dull, and soon he appeared gaunt and lifeless. No matter how many potions or remedies he sought, the decay continued. Desperate, he sought out the sorcerer, only to find that the artisan had vanished without a trace. Legend says that one night, driven mad by his reflection, or lack thereof, Harrington shattered every other mirror in the manor except the cursed one. He stood before it, pleading for it to return what it had taken, but the mirror didn't listen. Instead, it claimed him entirely. The next morning, the servants found the Lord's empty clothes pooled before the mirror, as though he had vanished into thin air. From that day forward, the mirror was locked away in the manor, its power feared by all who knew the tale. For decades, the manor remained abandoned, until it was purchased by an ambitious historian named Dr. Evelyn Carter, intrigued by the legends surrounding it. Evelyn had spent years chasing stories of cursed relics, and the Mirror of Hollow Echoes was the most elusive of them all. Despite the warnings of the townsfolk, she was determined to uncover the truth. She believed that the mirror wasn't just a cursed object, but a gateway to something beyond comprehension, a realm where stolen reflections were trapped. Accompanied by her assistant, Michael, Evelyn moved into the manor. The locals watched uneasily as they restored the decaying building, knowing that disturbing the mirror could awaken something sinister. It didn't take long for Evelyn to find the mirror, hidden behind a false wall in the master bedroom. The frame gleamed as though freshly polished, but the glass seemed unnaturally dark, absorbing rather than reflecting light. Cautiously, she approached it, feeling an inexplicable pull. "Be careful," Michael warned, sensing something was off. Ignoring his unease, Evelyn reached out to touch the frame. The moment her fingers brushed the cold silver, the room seemed to darken, and her reflection flickered unnaturally. She pulled back, her heart racing. That felt strange, she admitted, though she couldn't hide her excitement. "It's real, Michael. The curse is real." That night, Evelyn began to dream of a strange world, one filled with shadowy figures wandering aimlessly, their faces blurred and indistinct. She awoke drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that she had seen the souls of those trapped by the mirror. Over the following days, Evelyn noticed subtle changes in her appearance. Her reflection seemed fainter, as though it were losing substance. Meanwhile, Michael reported seeing fleeting shadows near the mirror, as if something inside it was stirring. One evening, as Evelyn stood before the mirror, she noticed something terrifying. Her reflection didn't mimic her movements. Instead, it stood still, staring back with hollow eyes. When she turned away in fear, her reflection smiled. A cold, cruel smile that wasn't her own. Panicked, she called for Michael. "It's stealing me," she whispered. "It's taking my reflection." Michael, though skeptical at first, couldn't deny the strange occurrences. Together, they decided to conduct an experiment. They placed a covered mirror opposite the cursed one, hoping to reflect its power back onto itself. At midnight, they removed the cloth. The cursed mirror and the ordinary one faced each other, creating an endless corridor of reflections. The air grew cold, and a deep hum resonated through the room. Suddenly, the glass of the cursed mirror rippled like water, and ghostly figures began to emerge. Reflections stolen over the centuries. They reached out, desperate to escape, their eyes pleading for freedom. "We have to break it," Michael shouted. "No," Evelyn countered. "If we destroy it, we might trap them forever." As they argued, the mirror's power intensified. Shadows poured out, filling the room with a chilling fog. One of the ghostly figures, a young woman, stepped forward and whispered, "Help us." Evelyn realized that the only way to end the curse was to return what had been stolen. She grabbed an old lantern filled with blessed oil, a relic she had brought for protection, and hurled it at the mirror. Flames erupted, engulfing the frame. The cursed mirror cracked violently, its glass shattering into 1,000 fragments. A deafening scream echoed through the manor as the trapped reflections were released. The ghostly figures faded, their souls finally free. When the flames died down, all that remained of the mirror was a pile of melted silver and broken glass. Evelyn and Michael stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had witnessed settling over them. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn wrote a detailed account of her experience, ensuring that the truth of the cursed mirror would never be forgotten. The manor, once a place of fear, became a symbol of hope and redemption. As for Evelyn, she never fully recovered from the experience. Though the mirror was gone, she often caught glimpses of shadowy figures in the corner of her eye, remnants of a world that had once tried to claim her. And in a forgotten corner of the forest, hidden beneath years of overgrowth, lay a shard of the cursed mirror, still gleaming faintly in the dark, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to find it. Long ago, nestled between jagged mountains and mist-covered valleys, there was a forest unlike any other. Known as the Whispering Wood, it was a place shunned by locals, feared by travelers, and avoided by the brave. The trees there were ancient, their bark twisted into grotesque faces, and their leaves never seemed to fall, even in the dead of winter. But what made this forest infamous wasn't its eerie appearance. It was the voices. Those who dared venture into the forest reported hearing whispers, soft as the wind, murmuring strange words. Over time, it became clear that the whispers carried a chilling pattern. They spoke the names of the dead. Stories passed down from generation to generation, told of how the forest came to be cursed. Centuries ago, the land had been the site of a brutal war. Thousands of soldiers had fallen, their bodies left unburied to rot where they lay. In the aftermath of the carnage, grieving families sought to recover their lost loved ones, but most of the dead were never found. Heartbroken, the survivors cursed the land, demanding that it remember the names of those who perished. It is said that the trees absorbed the souls of the fallen, and with them, their memories. Ever since, the forest had whispered their names, ensuring that they would never be forgotten. Despite the warnings, there was one who sought the truth behind the legend. His name was Dr. Edward Holloway, a historian obsessed with uncovering the mysteries of the past. When he first heard the tale of the Whispering Wood, he dismissed it as mere folklore. But the more he read about it, the more intrigued he became. Accompanied by his assistant, Clara, Edward set out to explore the forest. He believed that if he could find evidence of the ancient war buried beneath the forest floor, it would be the discovery of a lifetime. "We'll find ruins, relics, perhaps even remains," he told Clara as they stood at the forest's edge. "This forest holds the key to a forgotten history." Clara, less enthusiastic, glanced at the gnarled trees. "Let's just hope it doesn't hold anything worse." As they ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew heavy, and the world around them seemed to grow quieter. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the forest floor. The trees loomed over them, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. That night, they set up camp near a small clearing. As the fire crackled, Edward pored over his notes while Clara kept watch. It wasn't long before she heard it, the whispering. "Edward, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward lifted his head, listening intently. At first, he thought it was the wind rustling through the leaves, but then he heard it. Soft, indistinct whispers, as if 100 voices were speaking at once. "They're saying something," Clara whispered. She leaned closer to the trees, straining to make out the words. Their names. Edward stood, heart pounding. He had expected strange sights, perhaps remnants of ancient battles, but this was something else entirely. He approached the nearest tree and placed a hand on its bark. The whispers grew louder, clearer. James Whitaker, Sarah Price, Thomas Holloway. Edward froze at the last name. "That's my family name." Clara backed away, fear etched on her face. "Edward, this isn't right. We should leave." But Edward was transfixed. "No, this is proof. Proof that the legend is real." The next morning, Edward insisted on pressing deeper into the forest. Clara, reluctant but unwilling to leave him alone, followed. As they walked, the whispers grew louder and more distinct. Now they could hear full sentences. "Remember us. Do not forget." They came across a large oak tree with bark so thick it seemed to pulse. Carved into its trunk were hundreds of names. Edward knelt before it, tracing the letters with his fingers. "This tree, it's like a monument," he said. "A memorial to the dead." As he spoke, a chill swept through the clearing. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. Clara clutched Edward's arm. "Something's happening." Before they could react, the forest floor split open, revealing a cavernous pit beneath. From its depths rose a spectral figure, clad in tattered armor, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You have come to disturb our rest," the figure said, its voice echoing through the forest. "No," Edward said, stepping forward. "We seek to honor you, to learn your story." The ghostly warrior studied him for a moment, then spoke again. "If you wish to learn the truth, you must bear witness to our suffering." In an instant, the world around them changed. The forest disappeared, replaced by a battlefield strewn with corpses. Edward and Clara found themselves standing amidst the chaos, watching as soldiers fought and fell. "This is the war," Edward whispered, horrified. They saw families searching for their loved ones, weeping when they could not find them. They saw the curses cast upon the land, and they felt the grief that had seeped into the soil, giving rise to the whispering trees. When the vision ended, they were back in the forest. The ghostly warrior stood before them once more. "You have seen our pain," it said. "Now you must choose. Leave this place and forget what you have seen, or stay and ensure that we are remembered." Edward, tears in his eyes, knelt before the spirit. "I will tell your story. The world will know of your sacrifice." The ghost nodded, and the whispers began to fade. The forest grew still, as if at peace for the first time in centuries. Edward and Clara left the forest the next day, forever changed by what they had experienced. True to his word, Edward wrote a detailed account of the Whispering Wood, ensuring that the names of the fallen would never be forgotten. Years later, travelers passing by the forest would pause and listen. Though faint, they could still hear the whispers of names carried on the wind, a reminder of those who had been lost but never forgotten. And deep within the forest, the ancient oak stood tall, bearing the names of the dead, a testament to the power of memory and the enduring need to be remembered. There was a legend in the small, rain-soaked town of Graymore, whispered from one generation to the next, about a house that appeared only during the fiercest of thunderstorms. Known as Stormhaven Manor, it was said to vanish as soon as the storm passed, leaving no trace of its existence. Some claimed it was a portal to another realm. Others believed it was cursed, a place where tragic souls lingered. Despite the warnings, many sought it out, but few lived to tell the tale. One particularly stormy night, decades ago, a young boy named Thomas Greaves had ventured out during a thunderstorm to find his runaway dog, Shadow. As lightning cracked across the sky, Thomas caught sight of a large looming structure where the forest should have been. Shadow barked, running toward it, his black fur disappearing into the darkness. "Shadow, come back!" Thomas shouted, but the dog had already vanished through the front gate. The house was imposing, its spires reaching for the clouds with ivy-covered walls that seemed to writhe under the relentless rain. Despite his fear, Thomas followed his dog. The door creaked open as if inviting him inside. The moment he stepped through, the storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. The grand hall was dimly lit by flickering chandeliers, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like blood. "Shadow?" Thomas called, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. He didn't find his dog, but he did find something else. Shadows moving unnaturally across the walls, whispers that seemed to come from the very foundation of the house. Thomas never returned home. In the years following Thomas's disappearance, others reported seeing the house during thunderstorms. Some, driven by curiosity or desperation, entered its doors. Those who were lucky stumbled out after the storm, disoriented and babbling about shifting hallways, ghostly figures, and rooms that seemed to trap time itself. Others were never seen again. The legend grew, and with it, the fear. The townspeople learned to stay indoors during storms, windows shuttered and doors locked tight. They told their children never to follow the sound of whispers or approach the phantom house, no matter how tempting it might seem. One man, however, was determined to uncover the truth behind Stormhaven Manor. Dr. Elias Thorne, a professor of folklore and paranormal studies, had spent years collecting every scrap of information about the house. He pored over old maps, journals, and police reports, piecing together a fragmented history. Elias's research revealed that Stormhaven Manor had once belonged to the wealthy Bellamy family in the late 1800s. They were known for their extravagant parties and their love of the occult. But one stormy night, during a seance gone wrong, the entire family vanished without a trace. Their mansion burned to the ground, yet witnesses swore they saw its silhouette reappear during thunderstorms. Elias was convinced that the house was trapped between worlds, a beacon for restless spirits. Determined to prove his theory, he prepared for the next storm, equipping himself with cameras, recording devices, and a journal. When the storm finally came, Elias stood at the edge of the forest, rain lashing against his coat. Lightning illuminated the outline of the manor, just as he had read in the reports. Heart pounding, he pushed through the iron gates and ascended the crumbling steps. The door swung open before he could knock. Inside, the house was both majestic and decayed. Chandeliers hung precariously, their crystals dull with age. Paintings of the Bellamy family adorned the walls, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. Elias set up his equipment in the main hall. As he adjusted his camera, a voice broke the silence. "You've come to join us, haven't you?" He spun around to see a woman in a tattered gown standing at the base of the grand staircase. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned and ascended the stairs, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. Compelled, Elias followed her, his camera clutched tightly. The woman led him to a room filled with ornate mirrors, each reflecting a different scene: a family dining together, a child playing with a dog, a woman sobbing in a darkened room. Elias realized these were glimpses of the Bellamy family's lives before the seance. "They were trapped here," the woman whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "And so are we all." "Who are you?" Elias asked again. "I am what remains," she said, her form flickering like a dying flame. Before Elias could ask more, the mirrors shattered and a deafening roar filled the room. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor beneath him buckled. Elias stumbled back into the hallway, only to find it had changed. The doorways shifted, and the hall stretched endlessly. Shadows oozed from the cracks, taking on ghastly shapes. "You don't belong here," a voice boomed, shaking the very foundation of the house. Elias ran, his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. Every door he opened led to another nightmare. Rooms filled with drowning water, others with walls that bled, and one where he saw his own reflection aged and decaying. The house was alive, feeding on his fear, pulling him deeper into its labyrinth. Desperate, Elias recalled the journals he had read. The only way to escape was to endure the storm until the house disappeared. He fought his way back to the main hall, the whispers now a deafening cacophony. As the storm raged outside, the house began to tremble. The chandelier crashed to the floor, and cracks spread across the walls like veins. Elias threw himself out the front door just as the house began to dissolve into the rain. He landed hard on the muddy ground, gasping for breath. When he looked back, the house was gone. Elias returned to town, his body battered but his mind even more so. He tried to explain what he had seen, but few believed him. Those who did urged him never to return. But Elias knew he couldn't stay away. The house still held its secrets, and he was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. And so each time a thunderstorm rolled in, Elias would watch from his window, waiting for the silhouette of Stormhaven Manor to reappear. The house had let him go once, but he knew that one day it might not be so merciful. Years later, during another violent storm, the house reappeared, its outline stark against the lightning-lit sky. Elias entered it one final time. He was never seen again, but on stormy nights, townsfolk swore they could hear his voice among the whispers, calling out for someone to join him in the house that refused to stay gone. In the heart of the quiet cobblestone town of Blackwood stood an old, decrepit mansion known as Ashgrove Manor. The mansion had long been abandoned, save for one artifact left behind, a large framed painting that hung in the main hall. This painting was the subject of countless rumors and dark tales. Locals whispered that it was cursed, for it did something unnatural. The scene within the painting changed every night. The origins of the painting were unclear, but the story most often told involved Reginald Ashgrove, the eccentric artist who once owned the manor. Known for his fascination with the occult, Reginald spent his final years obsessively working on a single painting. His servants claimed they heard him muttering incantations as he painted, his eyes wild with a feverish intensity. One stormy night, a loud crash echoed through the halls of Ashgrove Manor, and when the servants rushed to the artist's studio, they found it empty. Reginald Ashgrove had vanished without a trace, leaving only the painting behind. From that day forward, the painting began to change. Each night, the serene forest scene that Reginald had painted would shift into something else. Sometimes something beautiful, other times something horrific. After decades of abandonment, Ashgrove Manor was finally purchased by a wealthy collector named Victor Hargrave, who had heard of the painting's legend and sought to possess it. Victor was not a superstitious man. He prided himself on his rational mind and believed the changing painting to be nothing more than an elaborate hoax. Accompanied by his assistant Clara and a small team of experts, Victor moved into the manor to study the painting. On their first night, they carefully observed the artwork, which depicted a peaceful meadow bathed in golden sunlight. "It's just a clever trick," Victor said, examining the painting closely. "Perhaps it's layered with some kind of optical illusion or light-sensitive material." Clara, however, couldn't shake the unease she felt as she gazed at the painting. There was something about it, something alive. That night, Victor set up cameras and motion detectors around the painting. As the storm outside raged, the mansion grew eerily quiet. At midnight, a sudden gust of wind howled through the halls, extinguishing several candles. The cameras recorded nothing unusual, but when the team returned to the hall at dawn, the painting had changed. Instead of the meadow, the scene now depicted a dark forest, with twisted trees and shadows that seemed to shift when no one was looking. "This must be some sort of advanced trick," Victor muttered, though doubt crept into his voice. "Clara, take detailed photographs. I want to compare them to last night's images." Clara did as instructed, but as she stood before the painting, she felt an inexplicable chill. She could swear she heard faint whispers coming from it. On the second night, the painting changed again. This time it depicted a stormy sea with a lone ship struggling against monstrous waves. As Clara stared at it, she noticed something chilling. The figures on the ship were moving, their faces twisted in terror, as if they were aware of being watched. "I don't like this," Clara said quietly. "This isn't normal." Victor dismissed her concerns. "Nonsense. It's a mechanical contraption, nothing more. We just need to figure out how it works." But as the night wore on, Clara couldn't sleep. The whispers grew louder, and when she peeked into the hall, she saw shadows moving across the walls, though no one else was there. On the third night, the painting changed again. This time, it showed something much closer to home. Ashgrove Manor itself, its windows glowing with a sinister red light. As the team watched in a stunned silence, they noticed movement in the windows. Figures began to appear, figures that looked disturbingly familiar. That's us," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Indeed, the figures in the painting were identical to the people in the room. They watched in horror as the painted versions of themselves moved about the manor, looking fearful and confused. Victor, determined to prove that there was nothing supernatural about the painting, reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed the canvas, a deafening crack of thunder echoed through the mansion, and the room was plunged into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Victor was gone. Panic set in among the remaining team members. Clara ran to the painting, and to her horror, she saw Victor inside it, pounding on the windows of Ashgrove Manor. His eyes were wide with terror, and though she couldn't hear him, she knew he was screaming. "We have to get him out," Clara cried, but there was no way to free him. Every attempt to interact with the painting only caused the scene to shift again, showing new horrors, fire, floods, and shadows that seemed to close in on the trapped figure of Victor. Clara spent the next day poring over Reginald Ashgrove's journals, desperate for a solution. In one of the final entries, she found a chilling passage. "The painting is a gateway, a living thing that feeds on fear and traps souls. I thought I could control it, but it is beyond any mortal's grasp. To gaze upon it is to invite madness. To touch it is to invite doom." Realizing the truth, Clara knew that the only way to stop the curse was to destroy the painting. Armed with a can of gasoline and a torch, she returned to the hall that night. The painting now showed her, standing in front of it with the torch in hand. The whispers grew deafening as she approached. Shadows leapt from the walls, trying to stop her, but she pressed on. With trembling hands, she lit the torch and threw it onto the canvas. The fire consumed the painting instantly, and with it, the whispers ceased. The shadows retreated, and the house grew eerily quiet once more. But Victor never returned. Clara left Ashgrove Manor that night, vowing never to speak of what had happened. The mansion was abandoned once more, and the townspeople believed the curse had finally been broken. Yet on stormy nights, some claim they still see the flicker of flames in the windows of Ashgrove Manor and hear the faint whispers of those trapped within the painting, forever calling out for help. Years later, a new family moved into the town. Among their belongings was an old weathered frame with a blank canvas inside. That night, as thunder rumbled in the distance, a faint image began to appear, a serene meadow bathed in golden sunlight. In the small, sleepy town of Ravenwood, something peculiar began to happen. It started quietly, with only a few strange occurrences that no one paid much attention to at first. A flicker of movement in the corner of someone's eye, a shadow shifting ever so slightly when it shouldn't have. People brushed it off as imagination or tiredness. But over time, the phenomenon grew harder to ignore. It was Maggie Fisher, the local librarian, who first voiced her concerns. One chilly autumn evening, while she was alone in the library closing up, she noticed something strange. The dim light cast long shadows across the shelves, but as she walked past them, she felt as if they were moving. At first, she thought it was a trick of the flickering lamps, but when she turned around, she saw it, a shadow stretching toward her, even though nothing in the room could have caused it. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. She backed away, fumbling for her keys. As soon as she left the library, the feeling vanished, but the memory stayed with her. The next day, she told her friend Tommy Blake, who owned the town's hardware store. "You'll think I'm crazy," she said, her voice trembling, "but I swear, the shadows moved." Tommy laughed it off. "You've been working too hard. Maybe get some rest." But that night, Tommy had his own encounter. While locking up the hardware store, Tommy felt something cold brush past him. He turned sharply, but no one was there. What he did see, however, was the shadow of a man standing in the far corner of the store. But when he looked directly at it, the shadow didn't move. The moment he turned his eyes away, though, he saw it shift in the reflection of the glass door. "Hello?" he called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. No answer came, but the shadow continued to edge closer whenever he wasn't looking directly at it. Panicked, he locked the door and ran out into the street, not daring to look back. The next morning, Tommy visited Maggie. "You're not crazy," he admitted. "I saw it too." Word began to spread around the town. Everyone had a story. Shadows that moved on their own, strange feelings of being watched when no one was there. Some people thought it was a prank, while others believed it was something darker. Concerned by the growing fear, the town's mayor, Henry Caldwell, called for a meeting. The townspeople gathered in the old church, whispering nervously among themselves. "Let's not panic," Henry said. "There's got to be a logical explanation for this. Maybe it's just a weird weather phenomenon or some kind of optical illusion." But before he could say more, the candles in the church flickered wildly, casting strange, elongated shadows across the walls. The townspeople gasped as the shadows began to shift and dance, even though no one in the room was moving. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the wall and slithered across the floor like smoke. People screamed and backed away as it crept toward the altar, growing larger with each passing second. Henry, trying to maintain control, shouted, "Stay calm!" But his voice wavered with fear. The shadow loomed over the altar, forming a dark, humanoid shape. Though it had no face, everyone felt its gaze. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. Desperate for answers, Maggie, Tommy, and a few others decided to investigate. They visited the town's oldest resident, Eleanor Gray, who was known for her knowledge of local folklore. Eleanor listened quietly as they described the moving shadows. When they finished, she nodded gravely. "I hoped this day would never come," she said. "You see, Ravenwood has a dark past, a past most people have forgotten." According to Eleanor, over a century ago, a group of villagers had dabbled in forbidden rituals, hoping to harness the power of shadows. They believed that shadows were more than mere absence of light. They were living things, entities from another realm that could be summoned and controlled. But something went terribly wrong. The ritual unleashed the shadows, which began to move and act on their own. To stop the chaos, the villagers sealed the spirits in a sacred artifact hidden beneath the old church. It seems the seal has weakened, Eleanor concluded. The shadows are waking up. With Eleanor's guidance, Maggie and the others prepared to reseal the shadows. They gathered ancient symbols, candles, and ingredients for a protective circle. That night, they returned to the church where the shadows had been most active. As they began the ritual, the air grew cold and the shadows gathered, writhing like a living sea. Dark tendrils reached out, trying to breach the circle. Maggie recited the incantation Eleanor had taught her, her voice steady despite the terror in her heart. The shadows hissed and recoiled, but they didn't retreat entirely. "It's not working," Tommy shouted over the rising wind. Eleanor, who had joined them despite her age, stepped forward. "You must confront them," she said. "Show no fear. Shadows feed on fear." Summoning all her courage, Maggie stepped out of the circle. The shadows swirled around her, whispering threats and secrets. But she held her ground, focusing on the light within herself. Slowly, the shadows began to fade, drawn back into the seal beneath the church. With a final flash of light, the ritual ended. The shadows were gone, and the air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The town returned to normal, though the events of those nights were never forgotten. The townspeople honored Maggie, Tommy, and Eleanor for their bravery. As for the church, it was closed off, with a plaque warning future generations of the dangers lurking beneath. Maggie continued to run the library, but she never stayed late at night anymore. Tommy expanded his hardware store, but he always kept the lights bright and the windows clear. And Eleanor, though frail, lived out her days knowing she had helped protect her town one final time. Yet on quiet nights when the wind blew just right, some claimed they could still hear faint whispers and see shadows flicker where they shouldn't. Because shadows never truly disappear, they only wait. In a remote valley hidden by dense forests and high mist-covered mountains, there lay a peculiar little town called Ridge. From the outside, it looked like any other small town. Cobblestone streets lined with quaint houses, a bustling market square, and cheerful residents who greeted each other warmly. Yet Ridge harbored a strange, unsettling secret. No one in the town could remember the events of the previous day. It wasn't something the townspeople openly acknowledged because they didn't realize it was happening. Each morning, they woke up believing everything was normal, blissfully unaware that they had forgotten the entire day before. The calendar pages turned, the seasons changed, and life in Ridge moved forward. Yet time felt strangely frozen. When visitors happened upon the town, they would quickly notice something was off. Conversations felt oddly repetitive, and even when they shared something personal with a local, the next day it was as if the conversation had never happened. "I swear we spoke about this yesterday," one traveler once said to Mr. Harris, the town's baker. "Yesterday?" Mr. Harris frowned. "I don't remember that. Are you sure you're not mistaken?" The traveler left soon after, unsettled by the eerie atmosphere. Those who stayed longer found themselves inexplicably drawn into the same cycle. By the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late. They too would wake up each morning with no memory of the day before. One foggy morning, a young woman named Clara Wells arrived in Ridge. She had been hiking through the mountains when a sudden storm forced her to seek shelter in the town. Unlike most visitors, Clara was immediately struck by the strange feeling in the air, as if the town itself were hiding something. When she checked into the local inn, the innkeeper, Mrs. Turner, greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome to Ridge. We don't get many visitors this time of year." "Thank you," Clara said, setting down her backpack. "How long has this town been here?" Oh, a long time, Mrs. Turner replied vaguely. Longer than anyone can remember. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had a habit of journaling her travels, and before falling asleep, she wrote down everything she had experienced that day. When Clara awoke the next morning, she felt an odd sense of disorientation. For a moment, she couldn't remember why she was in Willowridge. Then she spotted her journal on the nightstand and flipped through it. I arrived in Willowridge today. The people seem friendly, but something feels off. They don't remember anything from the previous day. Clara's eyes widened. She had no memory of writing those words. Frantically, she dressed and went downstairs to speak with Mrs. Turner. "Good morning, dear," the innkeeper said cheerfully. "Mrs. Turner, do you remember me? I checked in yesterday." Mrs. Turner frowned, puzzled. "Yesterday? I don't recall anyone checking in." Clara's heart raced. Something was very wrong with this town. Determined to uncover the truth, Clara began exploring Willowridge. She spoke to shopkeepers, children playing in the square, and even the town's mayor, Mr. Larkin. Each conversation followed the same unsettling pattern. No one remembered anything beyond the present day. "Have you ever noticed that no one seems to recall what happened yesterday?" she asked Mr. Larkin. The mayor laughed nervously. "Oh, nonsense. Everyone's just busy, that's all." Clara wasn't convinced. She returned to the inn that evening and carefully documented everything again. She made a plan to confront the townspeople the following day, hoping to find someone who might remember something. When Clara woke the next morning, she found her journal untouched. This time, however, something strange happened. She could faintly recall fragments of the previous day. It was as if the act of writing things down had helped anchor her memories. She rushed outside, determined to test her theory. She approached a young boy playing near the fountain. "Hey, do you remember me?" The boy looked up, confused. "No. Should I?" But Clara wasn't alone. As she continued questioning people, she met a man named Daniel, who seemed different from the rest. "I think I remember you," Daniel said hesitantly, "but I'm not sure how." Together, they pieced together what little they could recall. Daniel had also started keeping a journal after noticing strange inconsistencies in his daily life. He believed something was preventing the townspeople from remembering, something supernatural. Daniel led Clara to an old crumbling tower on the edge of town. "This is where it all began," he explained. "According to legend, Willowridge was cursed centuries ago by a powerful sorcerer. The townspeople had wronged him, and in his fury he cast a spell that trapped them in an eternal present, unable to recall their past or plan for their future." "Is there a way to break the curse?" Clara asked. "There might be," Daniel replied, "but no one has ever tried." They discovered an ancient ritual in an old tome hidden in the tower's basement. The ritual required a relic said to be buried beneath the town square. Clara and Daniel gathered the necessary items and, under the cover of night, began the ritual. As they chanted the ancient incantation, the air grew thick with energy. Shadows danced around them, and a cold wind howled through the empty streets. The townspeople, drawn by the strange commotion, gathered to watch. Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from the relic, and the wind stopped. Clara and Daniel collapsed, exhausted but hopeful. The townspeople looked around in confusion, as if waking from a long dream. The next morning, for the first time in generations, the people of Willowridge remembered yesterday. Life in Willowridge changed after that night. The townspeople no longer lived in a perpetual fog, and visitors no longer felt the strange pull of forgetfulness. Clara stayed for a while, helping the town adjust to its newfound freedom. Eventually, she continued her travels, but she never forgot the peculiar town where nobody used to remember yesterday. Daniel became the town's historian, determined to preserve their past so that no one would ever forget again. And though the curse was broken, some whispered that the sorcerer's spirit still lingered, watching, waiting for a chance to return. But for now, Willow Ridge thrived, its people living each day fully, finally free from the shadow of forgotten yesterdays. In a quiet town nestled between two towering mountains, there was an old curiosity shop called Finch's Oddities. The shop was filled with forgotten trinkets, vintage clocks, peculiar antiques, and objects that seemed to carry untold stories. Among these items, tucked away on a dusty shelf in the far corner of the shop, stood a peculiar black rotary telephone. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, with its cord frayed and its once shiny surface dulled by time. No one ever noticed it, except for the occasional odd sensation people felt when they walked near it, as if it were silently watching them. One day, Eleanor Harper, a young journalist with a penchant for strange stories, entered Finch's Oddities. Eleanor was always drawn to the weird and unexplained. She had covered stories about haunted houses, mysterious disappearances, and urban legends. But nothing had ever given her the sense of unease she felt the moment she laid eyes on the black rotary phone. It called to her, not literally, but in a way she couldn't quite explain. "How much for the old phone?" she asked Mr. Finch, the elderly owner. Mr. Finch gave her a strange look. "That old thing? It doesn't work, you know, just an old relic." He hesitated, then added, "But if you want it, I suppose I can let it go for $20. Without thinking twice, Eleanor bought the phone, lugged it back to her apartment, and set it on her desk. It was heavy and cold, as if it had just been pulled from an icy river. She didn't know why she wanted it. It didn't fit her modern style, and it wasn't functional. Yet something about it intrigued her. That night, as Eleanor was preparing for bed, she heard a soft ringing sound. At first, she thought it was her cell phone, but when she checked, her phone was silent. The ringing continued, low and insistent, until she realized it was coming from the black rotary phone on her desk. Confused, she approached it slowly. The phone shouldn't have been able to ring. It wasn't even plugged in. Hesitantly, she picked up the receiver. "Hello," she whispered, her voice shaky. There was a moment of silence on the other end, followed by a faint, crackling sound, as if the line were old and worn. Then a voice spoke, soft, distant, and familiar. "Eleanor?" Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. It belonged to her grandmother, who had passed away 2 years ago. "Grandma?" Eleanor breathed, gripping the receiver tightly. "Is that you?" "Yes, dear," the voice said gently. "I've missed you." Eleanor's mind raced. This couldn't be real. Her grandmother was gone. Yet the voice on the other end was unmistakably hers. They talked for a few minutes, Eleanor asking questions, and her grandmother responding with the same warmth she remembered. Eventually, the line went dead with a soft click, leaving Eleanor standing in stunned silence. The next morning, Eleanor convinced herself that the call had been a dream. Maybe she had been overtired, or maybe it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But that night, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't her grandmother. It was a man she didn't recognize, who claimed to have died in a car accident years ago. "Why are you calling me?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," the man replied. "All I know is that this phone connects us, and we need someone to listen." Over the next few nights, the calls continued. Each time, a different voice spoke to her, some familiar, some unknown. They all shared the same eerie quality. They were the voices of the dead, reaching out from beyond the grave. Some sought closure, some simply wanted to be heard, and others had cryptic warnings about things to come. One night, Eleanor received a call from a young boy named Tommy, who claimed he had been trapped in an abandoned well when he died. His voice was faint and scared. "Please help me," Tommy whispered. "I don't want to be alone anymore." Eleanor felt a pang of sorrow. She knew she couldn't actually save the spirits who called her, but something about Tommy's plea made her want to try. She began researching local legends and old news reports, trying to find any mention of a boy who had fallen into a well. After hours of digging, she found a decades-old article about a boy named Tommy who had gone missing near an abandoned farmhouse just outside of town. Driven by a sense of duty, Eleanor visited the site the next day. The farmhouse was long gone, but she found the remnants of an old, crumbling well hidden beneath overgrown weeds. She placed flowers by the well and said a quiet prayer, hoping it would bring Tommy some peace. That night, when the phone rang again, it was Tommy's voice. But this time, it was filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. "I can rest now." As the weeks went by, the calls became more frequent. Eleanor found herself overwhelmed by the sheer number of spirits reaching out to her. Some nights the phone rang nonstop, each call more desperate than the last. She began to lose sleep, her mind constantly preoccupied by the voices of the dead. She tried to ignore the phone, but the ringing would haunt her, growing louder and more insistent until she had no choice but to answer. The burden of carrying so many voices began to weigh heavily on her. She felt isolated, unable to share her experience with anyone for fear of being labeled crazy. One stormy night, as lightning flashed outside her window, the phone rang again. Eleanor hesitated before picking it up. This time, the voice on the other end was different. It was cold, hollow, and menacing. "You've meddled too much, Eleanor," the voice said. "The living have no place among the dead." "Who are you?" she demanded, fear creeping into her voice. "I am the one who watches," the voice replied. "You've opened a door that should have remained closed. Now you must pay the price." The line went dead, leaving Eleanor trembling. That night, the phone didn't ring again, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. The next day, Eleanor packed the black rotary phone into a box and returned it to Finch's Oddities. "I can't keep this," she told Mr. Finch. "It's dangerous." Mr. Finch gave her a knowing smile. "You're not the first to say that." He placed the phone back on the dusty shelf, where it would wait for the next curious soul to come along. Eleanor left the shop, vowing never to speak of the phone again. But deep down, she knew that some connections could never truly be severed. Even now, late at night, she sometimes thought she heard the faint sound of a phone ringing in the distance, a reminder of the voices that had once reached out to her from beyond the grave. Nestled on the outskirts of a sleepy little town called Whispering Hollow, there was a grand estate known as the Fairweather Mansion. Though once a lively place filled with lavish parties and wealthy guests, it had long since fallen into disrepair. Most townsfolk avoided it, whispering rumors about strange happenings and a dark past. Yet despite its dilapidated state, one peculiar item remained perfectly intact. A large, intricately detailed dollhouse, an exact replica of the mansion itself. The dollhouse sat in the parlor, encased in glass as if it were a museum piece. It had once belonged to the Fairweather children, who had vanished under mysterious circumstances more than a century ago. No one knew what happened to them, only that their disappearance marked the beginning of the mansion's descent into ruin. Years later, the estate was purchased by a young couple, Claire and Evan Whitaker, who dreamed of restoring it to its former glory. Claire, an artist with a fascination for antiques, was particularly drawn to the dollhouse. The level of craftsmanship was astonishing. Every tiny detail, from the miniature furniture to the delicate wallpaper, was a perfect match to the real mansion. Even the windows were made of tiny panes of real glass. On their first day in the mansion, as Claire wiped dust from the dollhouse's surface, she noticed something strange. Peering through one of the miniature windows, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of light, like a candle burning in one of the tiny rooms. She dismissed it as her imagination, chalking it up to the late hour and the dim lighting. But that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Over the next few days, Claire and Evan began their renovations. As they worked, odd things began to occur. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in places they hadn't been left. Doors creaked open on their own, even when there was no breeze. At night, Claire would hear faint whispers echoing through the halls, but whenever she investigated, she found nothing. One evening, while Evan was out buying supplies, Claire decided to take a closer look at the dollhouse. She carefully lifted the glass casing and opened the front panel, revealing the fully furnished interior. As she examined each room, she noticed something peculiar. The tiny furniture inside the dollhouse was slightly out of place, as if someone had moved it since the last time she looked. Just then, she felt a sudden chill, and the candle beside her flickered violently before going out. In the dim light, she thought she saw shadows shifting inside the dollhouse, as though tiny figures were moving through the miniature rooms. That night, Claire had a vivid dream. She was standing inside the real mansion, but it was different. Everything was smaller, as if she had shrunk down to the size of a doll. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the faint sound of children laughing. Following the sound, she found herself in the nursery, where two ghostly children stood by the window, gazing out into the dark night. When Claire tried to speak, the children turned to her, their faces pale and translucent. "You shouldn't be here," one of them whispered. "They don't like visitors." Before she could ask what they meant, Claire awoke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. Beside her, the dollhouse stood silently, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her back from the dream. The next day, Claire confided in Evan about her strange experiences. Though skeptical, he agreed to help her investigate. Together, they spent hours examining the dollhouse and comparing it to the real mansion. That evening, as they studied the miniature dining room, they heard the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. Grabbing a flashlight, Evan led the way up the creaking staircase. They followed the sound to the nursery, where they found the door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was freezing, and the old rocking chair by the window was moving on its own. Suddenly, the dollhouse, which they had left downstairs, began to glow faintly. The tiny windows lit up, casting an otherworldly light across the room. Then, as they watched in stunned silence, tiny ghostly figures appeared inside the dollhouse, reenacting scenes from a bygone era. They saw the fair-weather children playing, the parents hosting a grand dinner party, and the servants bustling about. But as the scene unfolded, it took a darker turn. Shadows crept in from the edges of the dollhouse, enveloping the figures one by one. The children screamed, the lights flickered, and then silence. Determined to understand what was happening, Claire and Evan delved into the mansion's history. They learned that the Fairweather family had hosted a grand masquerade ball on the night the children disappeared. According to old newspaper clippings, a mysterious fire had broken out, but there were no signs of the children's bodies among the wreckage. Some believed they had been taken by something unnatural, while others claimed the dollhouse itself was cursed. Claire became convinced that the spirits of the Fairweather children were trapped inside the dollhouse, forced to relive their final night over and over. She believed that if she could recreate the events of that night, she might be able to set them free. On the anniversary of the Fairweather children's disappearance, Claire and Evan prepared a reenactment of the masquerade ball. They placed miniature candles in the dollhouse, dressed tiny figures in paper costumes, and played old music from the era. As the clock struck midnight, the dollhouse began to glow again, brighter than ever before. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and a whirlwind of shadows swirled around the room. The ghostly children appeared once more, but this time, they looked at Claire with hopeful eyes. "Thank you," they whispered in unison. "You've helped us remember." The shadows dissolved, and the glow from the dollhouse faded. Claire and Evan stood in a stunned silence, realizing that the spirits had finally found peace. After that night, the strange occurrences ceased. The mansion felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. Claire decided to keep the dollhouse not as a haunted relic, but as a reminder of the children she had helped. She placed it in a sunlit corner of the parlor, where it remained a beautiful, silent testament to the past. Though the spirits were gone, Claire sometimes thought she heard faint laughter echoing through the halls, as if the fair-weather children were still playing somewhere beyond the veil of the living world. And in a way, they always would be. In a small, forgotten village nestled deep in the woods, an eerie legend persisted for generations. Locals spoke in hushed tones of a ghostly child who appeared only at twilight. Those who followed her vanished, never to be seen again. They called her the Whispering Child, a pale, silent figure who beckoned lost souls into the afterlife. Long ago, before the village was shrouded in fear, it was a thriving community known for its orchards and peaceful meadows. But one fateful winter, a terrible plague swept through the region, claiming the lives of many, including dozens of children. Among them was a little girl named Ilara, whose story became the root of the haunting legend. Ilara had been just 6 years old when the illness struck. Her parents, stricken with grief, buried her beneath the old oak tree at the village's edge, a place she had loved to play. But soon after her burial, strange occurrences began. Villagers reported seeing a young girl wandering the fields at dusk, her pale form shimmering like morning mist. Those who ventured too close would vanish without a trace. Fear spread like wildfire, and soon the village was abandoned, its fields left to wither. Over time, only the brave or the desperate dared to enter the woods where Ilara was said to roam. Centuries later, a historian named Dr. Maren Collins arrived in the village, intrigued by the legend of the Whispering Child. Maren had spent years studying folklore and ghost stories, but something about this particular tale felt different. It wasn't just the idea of a haunting, it was the way the villagers spoke of Ilara, not with hatred, but with sorrow. Determined to uncover the truth, Maren set up camp near the old oak tree where Ilara was said to appear. The villagers, though wary, provided her with food and warned her to leave before nightfall. But Maren, driven by a need to understand the past, refused to be frightened away. On her third night in the village, Maren finally saw her. As the sun dipped below the horizon and twilight bathed the forest in shadows, a faint figure emerged from the mist. It was a little girl with long, dark hair and a simple white dress. Her eyes glowed softly, and though her lips did not move, Maren heard a whisper carried on the wind. "Come!" The voice was gentle, almost comforting, yet it sent a chill down Maren's spine. Summoning her courage, she stepped forward, determined to learn what she could. But as she approached, the child turned and began to walk toward the woods. Maren hesitated. She knew the stories of those who had vanished, but her curiosity outweighed her fear. Keeping a safe distance, she followed Ilara through the trees. The forest grew denser, and an unnatural stillness settled over the air. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing bathed in an ethereal glow. At its center was a small pond, its surface so still it mirrored the sky above. Ilara stopped at the water's edge and turned to face Maren. This time she spoke aloud. "They were lost, and I showed them the way." Maren's heart pounded in her chest. "Who are you helping? Where are you leading them?" Ilara tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "To the place where they can rest. They wander, trapped between life and death, and I show them the path." Understanding dawned on Maren. Ilara wasn't a vengeful spirit. She was a guide, helping souls who had died unexpectedly to find peace. The villagers' fear had twisted her purpose into something sinister, but in truth, she was a child offering solace to the lost. Maren felt a deep sadness for the ghostly child. "Is there any way to help you move on?" she asked gently. Ilara shook her head. "I stay because they still come. When the last soul finds rest, I will go." Before Maren could ask more, the air grew colder, and shadows began to gather at the edge of the clearing. Dark figures emerged from the trees, their forms shifting and indistinct. These were the wandering souls Alara had spoken of, lost, confused, and clinging to the world of the living. One by one, the spirits approached the child, who reached out her hand to each of them. As they touched her, their forms grew fainter until they disappeared entirely, their journey to the afterlife complete. But not all the souls were ready to leave. Some hesitated, their eyes filled with fear and anger. They turned toward Marin, sensing her life and warmth, and began to advance. Alara stepped between Marin and the approaching spirits. "You cannot take her. She is not yours." The spirits halted, their forms flickering uncertainly. Marin watched in awe as Alara's glow intensified, spreading out like a warm light that enveloped the entire clearing. One by one, the hesitant souls stepped forward, guided by the child's gentle presence. As they touched her hand, they too faded into the light. When the last spirit was gone, the forest grew quiet once more. Alara turned back to Marin, her glow dimming. "Thank you," she whispered, "for helping me finish what I began." Marin wanted to ask what she meant, but before she could speak, Ilara's form began to fade. The child who had guided souls for centuries was finally free. Marin returned to the village, forever changed by what she had witnessed. She documented the true story of Alara, the brave, selfless child who had spent centuries helping lost souls find peace. Her work brought new life to the village, turning it into a place of remembrance rather than fear. Though Alara was gone, some claimed they could still hear a soft whisper on the wind at twilight, a reminder of the little girl who once led the lost into the light.